Sanctions, what are they good for?
A new range of hard-hitting economic sanctions.
The most comprehensive sanctions.
Unprecedented sanctions.
En même temps que des sanctions fermes.
As far back as ancient Greece, governments have tried to force change on their enemies via blockades, embargoes, and yes, economic sanctions, which have become more and more popular in recent years as an alternative to military action. But do they work? Well, in apartheid South Africa they did, and maybe in the Balkans too. But most aren't effective. Don't take my word for it. A comprehensive study by 4 academics examined 174 cases of sanctions in the 20th century and found they were successful in only 1 out of every 3 cases. I mean, think about it. The Castro brothers in Cuba are still in power 54 years after JFK embargoed them back in 1962. Vladimir Putin shows no signs of relinquishing the Crimea despite a plethora of US and EU sanctions on Russia, and despite him even admitting to the economic damage they've caused. And even in those rare cases where some say sanctions work, for example in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was kept contained and his WMD programs we now know were destroyed, the human cost of them can be massive. Remember, the UN-led sanctions regime, described as a form of genocide by the then UN humanitarian coordinator in Iraq, has been blamed for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. And yet who can forget the official US response to that horrific death toll?
We think the price is worth it.
But these days, even the US government is more honest about the downsides. A senior US Treasury official under President Obama admitted in April that sanctions are not a silver bullet, constrain diplomatic relations, dampen commercial activity, and carry a risk of retaliation. But hold on, didn't crippling sanctions force the Iranians to agree to the nuclear deal? Not necessarily. One poll found 96% of Iranians said sanctions were worth it in order to retain the country's nuclear enrichment right. Meanwhile, 71% of Russians believe that Western sanctions are meant to weaken and humiliate Russia. Instead of blaming Putin for their economic woes, many Russians blame the West. Oh yes. Let's be clear, no one's saying sanctions don't work, never work, or should all be lifted at once. But given their failure rate and their human cost, isn't it time to start acknowledging the limits of sanctions? To be more judicious in their imposition, more careful in their implementation? Because make no mistake, it's not just war, sanctions can kill too.